This series is based upon and inspired by the 2021 series Squid Game, created by Hwang Dong-hyuk and produced by Netflix. It also features art created by the fabulous Andrew MacLaine. Without warning, the dormitory lights turn on, causing many players to squint or awaken from their rest. Some players near player 54, the old religious man with rosacea, rush over as his arms begin to shake more violently against his bed frame. Crouched over his bed, player 53, a middle-aged woman with a blonde quiff and chunky glasses, shouts at the nearest players to move away as he is going into shock. While they do as they are asked, player 56, a young man with dark skin and big brown eyes, bluntly asks player 53 why she is helping player 54 when someone that hateful should be left to die. A few players voice objections to player 56's opinion, but some appear to agree. Player 53 suddenly lets go of player 54 and shouts that he is having a seizure. Player 67, a lanky man with withered skin, tries to hold player 54's shaking legs still, but player 53 pushes him away. She supports the pillow under player 54's head, then explains how she is a paramedic, and from her experience, they should not restrain him. Player 54's eyes then roll back in their sockets, and player 53 shouts to get the guards, although they are already making their way over from the rear end of the dormitory. When the first of them reach this scene, player 53 firmly yet calmly informs that player 54 is having a seizure. The guards look to each other without a word, then player 53 yells at them to do something. Seconds later, the front doors fly open, and several more circle guards carrying a stretcher hurry down from the platform. They run towards player 54, and many players throughout the dormitory watch as he is quickly yet carefully loaded on. His shaking continues, and he begins frothing at the mouth when the stretcher is hurried back to the front platform. One of the guards stays behind and asks player 53 what happened. She recounts that player 54 complained he was exhausted after the earlier game, and he slept most of the afternoon, but only just woke up. With an urgent tone to his voice, the guard asks if player 54 ate or drank anything in the last hour. Player 53 paces over to his bed and picks up his half-empty water bottle. The guard takes this bottle from player 53's hand and examines the label. He thanks her and wishes her luck for the next game, before chasing after the other guards. Player 53 watches in shock as the stretcher is carried through the door by the shouting guards. She then looks round and seems dumbfounded when the other players who came to player 54's aid return to their beds and resume their earlier activities. Joanne, player 175, has been watching this incident from her bed. She continues to look ahead until Jeff, player 171, who was sat on the bed of player 174, asks what that was all about. Joanne replies that she does not know, then looks back to player 189, a young woman with long ginger curls, who is chatting and laughing to player 197, a young man with bleached blonde hair, on the row of beds at the back of the dormitory. Joanne grins and tells Jeff not to get distracted, as it is still his turn. He looks back to these two players and asks, "Works in a bar." Joanne focuses on player 189 for a few seconds, then turns to player 197 and confidently answers, "Blondie." Jeff shoots Joanne an amused grin and asks if she is sure, to which she replies, "Positive," explaining that ginger lacks the grit of a barmaid. Jeff scoffs and looks over to player 189, who is laughing at this moment. He nods, joking that Joanne is far too much of a realist. She smiles back and says it's her turn, then asks, "Professional singer." Jeff inhales with a pensive squint, and after a few seconds says that the girl looks more theatre school. Joanne chuckles but claims Blondie looks like a missing member of Bros. A second later, Nicholas, player 173, sits up in his bed and asks what's the point of this game when they have no way of knowing the right answer. Joanne jolts round and says she thought he was asleep, but Nicholas ignores this comment and shouts, "Excuse me, love," to player 189. Joanne gasps, and some other players at this end of the dormitory look over, until player 189 realises that Nicholas is addressing her. She looks back in bewilderment, and despite asking Nicholas to stop, Joanne appears amused by player 189's confusion. Nicholas then asks if player 189 could give them a few lines of Annie. She looks to Nicholas with a judgmental expression, until he promises to give her some of his food later. Player 189 raises her eyebrows, but after receiving a nod from Nicholas, she gets up from her bed and begins singing "The Sun Will Come Out," at first tentatively. However, she soon builds into a controlled yet vibrant and flourishing voice as she reaches the crescendo, which clearly impresses many players who are now listening. When player 189 finishes the chorus, applause follows, including enthusiastic cheers from player 197. Some of the audience demand another song, but player 189 simply mouths to Nicholas that he owes her. He nods back in agreement, and she sits back down to help player 187, a well-built Asian man with a bruised neck, retie his turban. With continued disbelief, Joanne gasps to Nicholas that this could have been really embarrassing, although he grins back and claims he heard her singing to herself in the bathroom earlier. Before Joanne can comment, Jeff lethargically rises from the bed of player 174 and states that he is still tired, so will hazard a nap. Joanne objects and asks Jeff to come with her to explore the rest of the dormitory, to which he simply yawns and asks why. She turns to the front screen and looks at the number beneath the word remaining players, which is displayed as 54, but she incorrectly reads that there are 34 players who she wants to get to know. Nicholas interrupts how there are actually 54 remaining players, which means there are 51 other players apart from the three of them. Joanne frowns and explains how she has always struggled with reading, especially numbers. Jeff then asks if she is dyslexic, but Joanne squints and asks what this is. Nicholas listens carefully as Jeff informs how this condition can affect people's ability to read and even write. He begins to explain more, when Joanne interrupts that if there are 54 players, this is even more reason to explore. Jeff smiles, but says he needs some shut-eye. Nicholas then offers to go with Joanne, and before she can respond, Jeff declares how this sorts it, and tells them to report back later, before walking to his bed. Joanne turns to Nicholas, and with a reserved grin, tells him to lead the way. They slowly head to the front of the dormitory, during which time they subtly discuss the players sleeping within the next rows. However, Nicholas soon becomes distracted by a football match beginning between 6 players at the front of the dormitory. Joanne also watches this match and asks how they got a football. Upon passing the next few rows, she notices player 123, a young man with several shoulder tattoos and braces, who is lying in his bed with something moving up and down over his groin. Joanne chuckles and taps Nicholas. He grins, but carries on walking and jokes that some people will do anything to get ahead. He smirks and seems to wait for a reaction from Joanne, although she becomes distracted by a quiet scraping sound a few rows ahead. Nicholas looks over and notices the jacket zip of Mary, player 95, sliding against the side of her bed as she feels for her water bottle on the floor. Nicholas briskly approaches and asks Mary if she is looking for her bottle. She darts her gaze towards him and nods, but asks who this is. He leans down to grab the bottle, which is rolled beneath the bed of player 94, then places it in Mary's hand, before introducing himself as Nicholas. Steve, player 98, turns over in his bed and watches as Joanne nods courteously in his direction. He smiles weakly in return, but turns back to Mary, who thanks Nicholas for handing her the water bottle, then asks what the time is. Joanne responds that there are no clocks or windows here, although it is probably dark out. Mary glances towards Joanne and asks who she is, although she simply responds, 175. Waking up in the adjacent bed, Diane, player 96, rolls over to watch Mary stretch as she gets out of bed. Diane observes Nicholas from behind until he turns round, at which point she looks away and pretends to examine her fingernails. Joanne then asks Mary how she is able to compete in these games if she cannot see. Steve frowns and Nicholas gives her a wary look, but Mary wraps the bed sheets around her body and replies that she has made it this far without seeing fuck all. Joanne grins and asks if she carries a white stick on the outside. Steve pulls an awkward face and asks Joanne if she has never met a blind person before, to which she responds that she has not. Mary smiles and answers how she doesn't have a stick, as she doesn't want to make herself a walking target. Diane turns back to them and asks why she does not have a guide dog instead. Mary looks over and says that as much as she would have loved to have one, she would not feel right about keeping the poor thing cooped up in her flat all day. Mary thoughtfully shares how she likes dogs, as they never judge, and Joanne shyly adds that she is sorry if she offended her. Yet Mary chuckles, and humorously explains how her life might be a bit easier if people just asked their questions as quickly as she has. Steve gives a thoughtful gaze, and Joanne turns to Diane, who stoically looks up from her bed. Following a brief silence, Joanne tells Diane that she likes her bracelet. Diane looks down to the scarlet-embellished bracelet on her wrist, then glances back up to Joanne, and replies that her father had it specially made for her as a graduation gift. Nobody speaks for a few seconds, until Mary claims she is bored of sitting down and needs to move around. She raises her hand, and a nearby circle guard comes over. She asks if there is a gym or open space they can use, although the guard shakes his head and leaves without another word. Nicholas and Joanne take their leave, and whilst they continue to the front of the dormitory, the latter comments that the posh girl was a bit frosty. Mary sighs that she wants to go to the gym. Diane comments how she cannot think of a worse place, and people who do aerobics look like idiots. Steve slowly sits up in his bed and asks why she is always criticizing other people. With an arched brow, Diane turns to Steve, who grimaces and asks what people who do aerobics, for example, ever did to her. She looks back for a few seconds, then replies that they have done nothing to her except offend her sense of style, although she is not in the best mood right now. She asks if Steve is on cloud 9 today, but Mary replies for him that they can at least be grateful to still be alive. Steve gulps and suggests they talk about something else, before asking Mary what she likes to do at the gym. She answers that although she cannot afford to go anymore, she likes to box in her flat. Diane frowns, with a slight grin, as Mary gleefully shares that she was the best boxer in her company. Steve looks thoughtfully to Mary, then walks over to her bed. Once he has stood before Mary, he holds out his hands and tells her to practice on him. She seems surprised, but Steve says he's ready. Mary feels ahead to his hands, then gets up and gently punches at first, although her force soon picks up and Steve starts to step back and circle her. After a minute, Steve asks Mary to wait a second, and he takes off his jacket. Diane's ever-bewildered expression briefly vanishes when she inspects his reasonably muscular arms. Mary then tells Steve to start boxing her, and after practicing some light punches against her hands, he begins to do so. Noticing that Diane is watching, Steve asks if she enjoys doing any exercise. She looks away to see other players spectating, and replies that the only exercise she does is dancing on a night out. She adds how in her free time, she prefers designing stuff that looks good, instead of becoming a sweaty mess. Mary orders Steve to stop tickling her hands and punch harder, joking how her grandmother could put in a greater effort, and Steve chuckles as he follows this order. Mary then asks Diane what she designs, to which she replies that dresses are her favourite, and she would love to see her creations on a catwalk someday. While still punching Mary's hands, Steve frowns. Diane notices this change of expression, and asks if they have fashion shows where he comes from. As Mary withstands quick punches against each of her hands, she sniggers and responds that of course they have fashion shows up there, then jokingly calls Diane a silly cow. Diane shrugs, and Steve excitedly states that Liverpool has just got its first ever clothes shop. Whilst he continues circling Mary, Diane smirks how she does not know if he is joking. Steve grins, and Diane turns to watch the ongoing football match at the front of the dormitory. After landing another string of punches, Steve and Mary stop boxing and gather their breath on the latter's bed. With a dreamy undertone to his voice, Steve tells Diane that he also enjoys dancing. Without being asked, he recalls how going to a rave allowed him just one night to forget everything, somewhere that nobody had a care in the world. He goes into more detail, claiming he enjoyed nothing better than feeling the beat of the music mix with the pulse of the crowd. Yet Diane recalls, and says that she would not want to rub bodies with 1,000 intoxicated strangers in a barn whilst listening to that shirt. She recalls how in the summer, her father led the campaign to ban a rave, which was due to happen the next day in her village. Mary asks why she does not find this surprising. Steve smiles and responds how they are good fun, but Diane asks with a hint of sarcasm if he only goes to these events in order to rebel against the system. Mary swigs from her bottle as Steve sits up and gestures around the dormitory, then answers that something has to change. Diane seems ready to reply, but finds herself holding back as she too looks around at the other players. A moment later, the football flies over from the front of the dormitory and bounces twice, before landing on Diane's bed and rolling into her leg. She yelps and slaps the ball away in a panic, and several players awaken or jump in alarm, with Mary frantically asking what has happened. Steve laughs and calls out that it's just a football. Mary seems to relax, but rolls her eyes as Steve hesitantly approaches the ball. He breathes out, then kicks it with enough force that it reaches the front of the dormitory. Player 86, a young man with patchy freckles and a newly scratched face, shouts, "What a shot!" from the bed in front. Steve smiles gingerly, and Mary asks if he is going to join in the match, but he gives a bittersweet smile and replies, "Not today." Diane watches the match with a cynical expression for the next minute, until player 159, a young Asian man with thick black hair, scores a goal from a sizable distance, which triggers a torrent of shouts and applause from the other players on his team. Diane shakes her head and mutters that they are acting like bloody hooligans. Steve twists around and orders her to shut up, as she is talking bare shirt. Mary glances over, and Diane's mouth slowly opens in shock, but Steve claims she does not know what she is talking about. Diane gasps and fires back that he does not know anything about her, but Steve replies how he does not care, and she could fork off this instant. Diane darts her gaze to Mary, who appears uneasy and conflicted. After a brief silence, Diane throws her water bottle to the ground, then uses several swear words to tell Steve and Mary what they should do to themselves. Mary does not react, but Steve snarls at Diane when she storms off to the empty bed of player 81. She lies upon it, and tears form in her eyes as she faces away to the adjacent wall. A minute later, Miss Green's voice is heard over the speakers, announcing that players will soon get a food and drink package, along with access to a smoking area at the front of the dormitory. A brief flurry of joy is triggered throughout the dormitory, and a line of circle guards enter through the front doors. They disband the football match to the annoyance of some players, although they all return to their beds without protest. Temporary barriers are then placed around a small but reasonably sized corner of the room between the front platform and side stairs. Yusuf, player 28, tenderly feels his swollen lip as he sits on the bed of player 24, opposite Alan, player 23. There are also bruises around his eyes and on his neck, yet he does not appear overly affected by these injuries. Instead, he watches with amusement as several players hurry to the smoking area, in which a guard has just entered with several packs of cigarettes at the ready. Circle guards push the trolleys through the empty first row of beds, then onto the second row, where they distribute packages to player 13, a short man with a shaggy beard, player 14, the young man with a long side parting, player 16, the mousy young woman with delicate glasses, and player 17, the older Geordie woman with white curls. The trolleys are subsequently wheeled onto the third row, in which only Alan, Yusuf, and Tracy, player 26, remain. Yusuf looks over to Tracy, who is waiting patiently on her bed, and he asks if she wants to eat her tea with him and Alan. It seems to take Tracy a moment to realise that Yusuf is talking to her, and she initially looks to him with a blank expression, but gradually smiles. She walks over and sits down with Yusuf on his bed. The trio receive their packages, and Yusuf and Tracy immediately open theirs, then dig into their chocolate bar and bread roll respectively. Yet Alan looks with somewhat of a repulsed snarl towards his food and closes his package. He breathes out through his bruised nose and looks up to the gallery. After noticing that Alan is not eating, but feeling his nose with a painful wince, Yusuf asks what's wrong. He simply replies how he does not understand why Helen did that for them. Yusuf nods and replies that he has no idea either. Alan agrees how it made no sense. Yusuf gives an uncomfortable smile and says none of them will ever know, but they need to make this second chance count. Alan blinks, and Yusuf gestures to his food, suggesting he keeps his energy up. Tracy takes out the water bottle from her own package. She cautiously raises it between the three of them, then even more cautiously proposes a toast to Helen. This clearly surprises both Alan and Yusuf, but they take out their own bottles and toast together in the middle. Yusuf and Tracy continue to consume the food in their packages, and Alan begins his block of cheese, but soon stops and puts it back down. Tracy looks over to him, and he asks if either of them are hot. He proceeds to unzip his jacket, but does not seem to notice a large rip in the bottom of his t-shirt beneath. Yusuf frowns and responds that he finds this place cold, especially at night. Tracy watches as Alan takes off his jacket. Then she notices a bloodstain on his left shoulder. Alan puts the jacket down on his bed and feels a hand through his sweaty, sandy hair, until Tracy points to his shoulder and informs he is bleeding. Alan's eyes widen when Tracy takes out a plaster from her package, but when she begins to open it, he moves away on his bed and warns her to stop. Tracy seems wary of Alan's sudden worry, and Yusuf advises Alan to let Tracy put on a plaster, or this wound could become infected. Alan cautiously asks Tracy to give him the plaster herself. She stares at him blankly as Yusuf notices the rip at the bottom of Alan's white t-shirt, which reveals a large lesion on his stomach. Tracy shrugs and mutters, "Okay," then reaches across to hand the plaster to Alan, when Yusuf grabs her from behind and pulls her back. Tracy gasps and frantically asks what Yusuf is doing, but he points to the lesion showing through the rip of Alan's t-shirt and demands to know what that is. Alan squints, then looks down and realises what Yusuf is referring to. He gulps and quickly tries to dismiss it as an injury from the early game. However, Yusuf shakes his head and points higher up on Alan's chest, to another dark lesion which is visible through the white fabric of his t-shirt. Alan hurries to put his jacket back on, and Yusuf exclaims that there's another one. Yusuf's expression turns to horror, and Alan's body is frozen as the men look into each other's eyes. Yusuf then asks with a horrified grimace if Alan has that gay cancer. Alan's breathing becomes erratic, and he mutters, "Please," but Yusuf stammers that he saw a story on the news about a man with those skin marks who also had it. Tracy frowns, and Yusuf grabs her by the arm. Then he steps back, shouting to get away from Alan. The players on the row in front look around, and Alan's face becomes paler as he begs Yusuf to stop. But Yusuf jolts back and shouts how he is not risking catching this disease. While Tracy finds herself backing away as well, player 14, the young man with a long side parting, points to Alan and asks what disease he has. Yusuf shouts back that he has AIDS. He continues moving along the row away from Alan, who is looking around in a panic at the players in the adjacent rows and smoking area as they begin to pay attention. Alan finds himself backing away towards the left side wall and darts his eyes around in a frenzy when player 14 carefully approaches but keeps his distance and asks if Alan caught this disease from being a homosexual or a junkie. Now backed up against the side wall, Alan does not answer, and his sweating accelerates as he unzips the top of his jacket. Several spectating players on adjacent rows rush to move further away from Alan, and player 16, the mousy young woman, covers her mouth with her jacket. Player 14 snarls and states that his money is on him being a filthy quire. Tears begin to flow from Alan's eyes as he begs them to stop, although several players are now shouting, with some protesting to him being in this room with them. This includes player 16, who runs up to the guard in the smoking area. With her jacket still over her face, she points to Alan and asks to be let out of the dormitory, as she does not want to get AIDS. Through the clamour which is now covering the front of the dormitory, Alan tearfully calls to Tracy for help, but she continues watching stoically from her bed. The circle guards come over and attempt to calm the surrounding players, most of whom are still clearly agitated. However, Carol, player 32, gets up from her bed, and although her leg appears to be causing her pain, she manages to limp over to Alan. She stands in front of him and shouts over the protests that nobody can get HIV or AIDS just from standing near an infected person. This briefly stops some of the noise, although player 34, an old man with one eye and a scarred face, asks how she could know this. Several players voice support for player 34, but Carol replies that she is a nurse, and research has shown how only sexual intercourse and blood transfusion can spread HIV or AIDS. Alan is now shaking against the wall and holding his hands against his head. Carol smiles and reaches out a hand to Alan, which causes several players to shudder as she helps him up. There are even several shouts at Carol to get away from him. Yet most players gradually seem to be convinced to some degree by Carol's actions. Over the next few minutes, the front of the room quietens down, and most observing players return to their beds, albeit with occasional glances of suspicion to Alan. Carol remains with him, while he continues to breathe deeply by the wall. She asks if he is okay, and he replies that he just wants a cigarette. Carol asks if this is the best idea, given his condition, but Alan uses a swear word to express what he thinks of her concern, and storms to the smoky area, muttering how he is going to die anyway. When they see Alan coming, many players huddle together at the end of the smoky area by the platform, with some voicing that he should not be allowed to smoke with them. However, Alan enters quietly and sits on the steps at the opposite end. He is then handed a cigarette by the circle guard, who lights it for him. Several players in and out of the smoky area watch as Alan wipes his tears and closes his eyes. He inhales the cigarette extremely deeply and leans back, seemingly ignoring the comments and stares before exhaling a large cloud of smoke. Meanwhile, Diane has been watching the furor at the front of the dormitory from the bed of player 81. After a minute of calm, she looks back to see Steve and Mary sat on the latter's bed, talking quietly and consuming the food and water from their packages. Diane tuts, but slowly walks over to the package which has been left on her bed. Steve notices her and looks away as she nears them. Diane walks past Mary's bed and sits down on her own, then grabs a Satsuma from her package and tells Steve that she is sorry if she upset him. He exhales, unwillingly looks towards her, and seems to be thinking of a reply, when Diane explains how she was not calling him a hooligan. Mary sits up and looks uneasily to Diane, as Steve turns away from her once more. Diane grimaces at this reaction, and is about to say more, when Steve sternly replies that this is not what made him angry. He explains how Diane was judging those guys for playing football, when all they were doing was enjoying the beautiful game, which he says with an ironic twang. Diane replies that she understands what he is saying, but football fans usually seem drunk and rowdy when they are watching football. Steve scoffs quietly, and Mary winces, subtly shaking her head in Diane's direction. Diane goes into more detail about the football fans she has seen in the newspapers, during which time Steve grinds his teeth until he suddenly gets up and growls at Diane, asking how many games she has actually attended. She turns to Mary, who also seems to be waiting for an answer. Steve snarls and asks None, right? Diane seems fazed, and Steve begins to approach her. He firmly declares that she is the sodding problem with this country, when tossers like her think they can judge the rest of us for no reason. Mary begins to show some concern when she hears Steve's voice moving closer towards Diane, claiming that real people have been affected by views like hers. Steve ends this sentence with more volume, almost shouting when he stops in front of Diane, which causes several players to look over. Diane backs away, then turns to Mary and asks why he is getting so angry over football. Steve swears, turns, and kicks the cover off the nearest bed. He grips his hands to the back of his head, and Diane tells Mary how she only came over to clear the air. Steve violently twists around and shouts a torrent of swear words at Diane. Several circle guards make their way over and ready their guns, but Mary marches over and stands between Steve and Diane, firmly ordering the latter to pass off for a minute. Diane storms off and, through a tirade of swear words, chucks the satsuma she has been holding over her shoulder. It narrowly avoids hitting player 123, who is still lying in his bed, with player 160, a slender young woman with thick blonde dreadlocks, but neither of this pair notice the near collision. Mary puts her hand on Steve's shoulder and tells him to take a deep breath. He looks down to the floor and simmers, until Diane shouts back to him from a few rows ahead that she lied in the earlier game about him having a nice smile. As Steve flares his nostrils and blinks, Diane stomps straight towards the smoking area, weaving diagonally between beds and almost knocking into several players, including player 34, the old man with one eye, who steps back and falls onto his bed. Diane pushes her way through the smoking players by the platform, towards the circle guard in possession of the cigarettes and matches. He sees Diane coming and hands her a cigarette, which she jams between her lips without thanking him. She then waits for him to light the cigarette until he realizes that his box of matches is now empty. The guard says he will go to grab another box and heads towards the front doors. Diane tuts and turns away to survey the other players in this area, some of whom are silently watching her as they smoke. However, Alan is still sat by himself on the steps. He begins his second cigarette, then dazedly faces into the dormitory, and therefore does not notice Diane until she is leaning down to sit next to him. Alan flinches, and Diane claims she needs this, before taking the cigarette from his hand. She brings it to her lips, then plonks herself down on the step next to Alan. As she inhales, several other smoking players shout at her to stop smoking this cigarette and get away from Alan, with a few shouting that he has AIDS. Alan looks forlornly to Diane, and she regards him with some wariness. After exhaling a small cloud of smoke from the cigarette, she asks if this is true. Alan says nothing initially, but takes back his cigarette from Diane's hand and begrudgingly replies that he is HIV positive. Whilst he inhales, Diane asks if you can get this through smoking. Alan exhales and responds how you can only get it through blood or sex. Diane looks at the end of the cigarette she just placed in her mouth, then towards the other players in the smoking area. Although some are still eyeing her with worry, she turns back to Alan and asks for another drag of the cigarette. Alan appears surprised, yet smiles timidly and offers it back. As he relaxes his torso, Diane exhales and claims she does not even smoke that much, but she just needed to get away from the other two players on her row. Seemingly intrigued, Alan asks what they have done. For the next minute, Diane shares the cigarette with him and speedily recounts the confrontation which occurred earlier between herself and Steve. Alan keeps up with the story, but just when Diane becomes short of breath, she declares that she has too much to think about with this shirt and can't mind her every word. Alan continues listening to Diane as she goes into more detail about how she was almost eliminated in the first round of Bulldog when she was knocked to the ground by a silly old codger with a moustache. During this time, the guard hands them each another cigarette, although Diane does not acknowledge the guard and continues talking. Tracy looks over from her bed and watches Diane finally stop to inhale. Alan interjects that it sounds like she had a rough time. Then he begins to describe how he was pinned down during the second round and bitten on the ankle. However, Diane almost immediately exhales and interrupts that she was bitten on her hand at the end of the third round. She shows her bite mark and elaborates on this story, although Alan seems somewhat disgruntled to be interrupted. Tracy casually walks into the smoky area and sits down at the bottom of the steps before them. Alan smiles cautiously, but Tracy does not notice and subtly looks towards Diane's bracelet. Diane continues looking to the ceiling as she narrates her actions during the last round of Bulldog until she finally exhales and stops talking. She then looks back ahead and jumps when she notices Tracy sat before her. The guard comes over once more and offers each of the trio another cigarette. Only Alan takes one this time, and Diane quietly watches as the guard lights it for him. After a few seconds, she apologizes for speaking so much, but claims to be bloody flummoxed with everything that has happened today. Alan shrugs with a smile, and sympathetically claims how it is nice to feel trusted with everything she is saying. A moment later, Mr. Orange announces from the speakers that the smoking area will now be closing, and bathroom visits will begin shortly. Alan hastily finishes off his cigarette, and the trio are ushered from the smoking area by the circle guard. Diane walks with Alan to his bed, then says that she has a few more rows to go, and thanks him for listening. Alan nods with a smile, and offers his name. Diane covers her mouth with a gasp, and exclaims how she completely forgot to ask. She puts out a hand as she offers her name, and Alan seems surprised, but shakes her hand with a warm smile. After wishing him a good sleep, Diane heads back to her bed. For the next 2 hours, players are dismissed in groups to the bathrooms. The front and back rows go to their nearest bathrooms first, followed by each adjacent row. Mary and Steve continue consuming the contents of their packages, and they discuss which game might occur next. They practice noughts and crosses, using items from each other's packages, and whilst they play, Mary also reviews several nursery rhymes, some of which Steve does not know. During this time, Mary occasionally looks over to Diane, who is resting on her bed. She asks Steve several times if Diane is alright, and he simply responds, "Yeah," each time, usually without even looking at her. After just over 2 hours of waiting, Mary, Diane, and Steve's row becomes the last to be escorted to the front bathroom. Once the circle guard present has performed a security check of the room, she gives them each a towel, flannel, and toothbrush, then informs that they have 15 minutes. Mary briefly uses the toilet, but spends the rest of this time at the sink, washing her face and brushing her teeth. Steve showers, then wraps a towel round his waist, and speaks to Mary as she meticulously runs a comb through her minute afro. Diane also showers until she hears Steve and Mary talking by the sinks. She changes into her tracksuit, leaves her cubicle, and cautiously joins them. Steve ignores Diane and focuses on brushing his teeth in the mirror. She places herself at the adjacent sink and seems unsure of what to say for a while, but eventually begins that she is sorry if she judged the football players too quickly. Mary glances over, and Diane awaits a response as Steve spits out toothpaste and looks at himself in the mirror. He exhales, forming condensation, and seems to be trying to form his words, but Mary comments that what Diane said earlier made her sound even more like a delusional brat. Still without looking at Diane's now perturbed expression, Steve gently nods. Diane frowns, yet Mary gestures to herself and Steve, and asks if she realizes how she comes across to them, for example. Diane responds that she understands what Mary is feeling, but Mary cuts in that Diane has no idea what she is feeling. Diane grimaces, and Mary explains how she would only have a way of knowing what life is like for her as a blind black woman living in poverty if she walked in her shoes for at least one day. Diane huffs with an expression of discomfort, and Mary asks if she knows what it is like to be stopped by police and searched for no reason, or given suspicious looks if she ever goes into a new shop. With a tone of hopeless amusement, Mary jokes that she cannot even tell anymore what looks people are giving her. She then practically shouts how she had no choice but to come back here. After pensively looking at herself in the mirror, Diane concedes how she may have had an easier life. She is about to continue speaking when Steve finally turns, looking impatiently towards her in the reflection of the mirror. Diane pauses and says, "Okay," before admitting that she has indeed had an easier life than them. However, she proceeds to ask why, though, she would choose to come back to these games if her life was still so easy. Mary confesses how she was wondering this herself. Staring sullenly into the mirror, Diane replies that she does not give two hoots about the money. Mary frowns and asks why else she would choose to come back, though, if not for the money. Diane gulps and tears form in her eyes as she gestures to her scarlet bracelet. She shakily explains that the man who gave her this bracelet is not her father anymore. Steve frowns and asks what Diane means. She shakes her head, and tears begin to fall down her cheeks. Over the next minute, she recounts the conversation she overheard between her parents when she was home, and how she was so upset by what her father said that she made the stupid decision to run away and return to these games. Mary walks over and finds herself rubbing Diane's back as she cries into the sink. Steve looks to her with a slightly sympathetic expression, but soon turns away. In a delicate tone, Mary then asks Diane if she knows who her real dad could be. Diane shakes her head and answers that it could be the milkman for all she knows, cynically explaining how her mother would likely have it away with anyone offering a glass of bread. Mary looks down in uncertainty, but slowly grins and comments that she could imagine Diane's father being someone like Basil Fawlty. Diane gasps and glances up from the sink to Mary, who is unsuccessfully trying not to smile. Diane looks over to Steve as well, but he smirks when he notices her shocked expression. He sniggers and reasons how this is only fair after her earlier comment. Mary laughs again, and a reluctant grin forms through Diane's tears. As Steve continues to chuckle, she wipes away a tear and humorously asks, "How dare you?" Steve then comments that she even has Mr. Faulty's shrill voice, and Diane wipes away another tear, but jokes how she will allow this one only because he led the way in the earlier game. While Steve's amusement morphs into a calm smile, Mary adds that she also had to defend the tower without even being able to see. Still with an expression of reluctant amusement, Diane asks if Mary would like to insult her again in this case. Yet Mary shakes her head and fiendishly replies how she wants to know what Diane's face looks like. Steve gives a curious smirk as Diane screws up her face and asks what Diane is talking about. Mary replies that she does not know what either of them looks like, not their hair, their faces, or even their skin colours. With a touch of trepidation, Diane states that she is white, although Mary interrupts how she did not need eyesight to know that. Diane appears bewildered, but Mary dries her hands on the towel and with a hint of laughter promises that if she can feel Diane's face, she will forgive her for anything she has said. Steve chuckles how this is a bargain and tells Diane to let Mary do a Lionel Richie. Diane glares at Mary's hands, but a few seconds later looks up to her eyes and with a look of pure unease says that she has 10 seconds. Mary proceeds to run her hands gently over the chin, cheeks, and forehead of Diane, who maintains an uncomfortable grimace. Through the mirror, she spots Steve's amusement and silently shows him a middle finger, but he chuckles back. With an inquisitive smile, Mary moves her hands up to Diane's blonde crimps and comments that she has nice hair. Diane lets out a weak but still awkward smile, and Mary asks what she uses. Diane simply replies, "Shampoo," then steps back and says this was much longer than 10 seconds. Steve chuckles loudly and the door flies open. He and Diane both jump in surprise. The guard enters and declares it all very well how they are finding time for a jolly, but their bathroom time is now over. Mary, Diane, and Steve are led back to the dormitory, and the lights are darkened as they walk to their beds. Within 40 minutes, most players are sleeping, with just a handful of circle guards stood at either end of the room. For the first few hours of the night, the only sound heard by some players is the intimacy between player 123, the young man with tattoos and braces, and player 160, the young woman with blonde dreadlocks, within the bed of the latter. This seems to be purposely ignored but tolerated by the nearest players. In the early hours of the morning, player 54, the old religious man with rosacea, is returned on a stretcher to his bed, after having had his stomach pumped of toxins. He is clearly in a fragile state, yet manages to fall asleep with a crucifix gripped to his chest, and a guard stood by his bed. The next morning, at a later time compared to previous days, players are awoken to the tune of "I Vow to Thee My Country" by Gustav Holst. They are then given breakfast packages and access to the bathrooms and smoking area. At the back of the dormitory, Joanne is lying by the bed of Pat, player 177, and lifting up the mattress in order to unscrew one of this bed's legs. Nicholas and Jeff are sat on their beds, eating from their packages and discussing the current state of the nation's job market. Yet when they hear the leg of Pat's bed being unscrewed, Nicholas gets up and approaches with a bacon sandwich in hand. He watches for a moment and asks what Joanne is doing. She jumps and twists round, then gathers her breath and answers that she would feel safer with a weapon after what happened to the church guy. Nicholas opens his mouth in confusion, but notices 2 circle guards coming over from the nearest corner and warns her to watch out. Joanne glances up and swears as these guards approach. She tries to cover the bed's leg with its sheets, but the taller of the 2 guards reaches them before she can do this, and asks in a distorted voice what the big idea is. Joanne looks up and seems unsure for a few seconds, yet responds with a smile that she wanted to look at the bed's springs to see what made it so comfortable. Nicholas and the shorter guard turn to Joanne, then the taller guard orders her not to tamper with any furniture in this room. She laughs and with a curl of her lip, asks what he is going to do about it. While Jeff rushes over, the guard gestures to his baton and claims that this would be the tip of the iceberg. Jeff shoots Joanne a warning glance, but she grins and approaches the taller guard, which appears to bewilder most observing players. She suggestively runs her hand along the baton, and in a mockingly seductive voice, claims she could handle it. Jeff whispers to Joanne to stop, but she giggles back as he tries to convince the guards that she is only joking. Jeff walks over and many other players watch the shorter guard near him with a raised baton, which prompts him to be quiet. The taller guard suddenly swipes the baton to within inches of Joanne's head. She yelps out and falls back onto her bed. Jeff snaps her to be quiet, but Joanne begins to giggle, then opens her legs, and with a smirk, begs to be hit for real this time. Before Jeff can say anything, the taller guard grabs Joanne up by the arm. While the shorter guard holds Jeff back, Joanne is dragged towards the doors at the back of the room. Most observing players are clearly in shock at this scene, but Jeff runs after the shorter guard and asks where they are taking Joanne. He jolts round, and with his baton gripped firmly in hand, barks at Jeff to return to his bed. After just over 15 minutes, player 187, the well-built Sikh man, and player 189, the young woman with long ginger curls, return from the bathroom. The shorter guard comes over and tells Nicholas and Jeff that it is now their turn. Jeff and Nicholas proceed to undress in the rear bathroom, and while showering in adjacent cubicles, they discuss Joanne's character and what they think may be happening to her. Just over 5 minutes later, the door to the bathroom quietly opens. Joanne's dark curls are messily strewn across her sweaty face. She approaches the nearest sink and looks straight into the mirror. Soon after, Jeff finishes his shower and leaves the cubicle with just a towel wrapped around his waist. He turns the corner and seems shocked to see Joanne stood before him. Jeff asks what happened, and Nicholas opens his cubicle door just enough to see Joanne in the reflection of the mirrors. She turns to Jeff and calmly replies that the guard only wanted to show who's boss, then jokes how he thinks she learned her lesson. Nicholas closes his cubicle door and continues washing his moustache as Jeff moves to a mirror on the opposite wall to Joanne. He still stares at her with concern and asks if she is sure she isn't hurt, but she shakes her head contently. Jeff seems hesitant to look away from Joanne, although he gradually focuses on the mirror and dries his wet blonde hair with a hand towel. He soon notices Joanne moving the messy hair from her face, and he comments that she looks a state. She sarcastically thanks Jeff, but he hurries to explain how he did not mean to offend her. She shoots him a knowing grin in the mirror and removes her tracksuit and t-shirt, then takes out a flannel from her wash bag. Jeff looks back into his own mirror, but soon becomes distracted when he notices Joanne in the reflection, running the flannel along her arms, her neck, and the gap between her breasts, which makes her white bra become wet. Within a minute, Joanne notices that Jeff is unable to stop regarding her in the mirror, and she approaches the sink next to him. She looks to his waist and he turns away, but she is still able to see movement beneath his towel. Jeff appears uncomfortable and moves himself against the sink. He looks ahead and nervously insists that he did not mean to call Joanne a state. She chuckles quietly and leans towards Jeff. His eyebrows rise in surprise, but he slowly turns and moves in to kiss her. Joanne reciprocates this movement, although she moves her mouth past Jeff's mouth, towards his ear, and softly replies that she believes him. Joanne winks, and as she walks back to her sink, Nicholas carefully closes his cubicle door without being noticed. Jeff smiles at Joanne in the reflection, then grabs his clothes from the sink and takes them into the nearest toilet cubicle. Once all players have been given bathroom access, Square Guard meets with the 4 triangle guards in the gallery which overlooks the dormitory. Square Guard begins the meeting by announcing how tests have been conducted on the bottle belonging to player 54. Mr. Yellow leans in curiously from his chair, as Square Guard informs that the results of the test show traces of cyanide within the bottle. Mrs. Blue exhales in shock, and Square Guard assures how an investigation has been initiated by the powers that be in order to establish how and why this happened. He subsequently explains that from what they know so far, this substance could have been imported to the compound by anyone, even one of the triangle guards themselves. Square Guard continues that to further complicate matters, several dormitory cameras malfunctioned yesterday. Mr. Yellow interrupts, asking how this happened, to which Square Guard responds that it was likely due to the heavy storm last night, which may have damaged the main generator's wiring. Mr. Orange leans back in his chair and looks over to the screens relaying the camera feed at the far end of the dormitory. Square Guard then reassures that this wiring has since been replaced, and all circle guards have been checked for possession of cyanide and any other kind of poison, although nothing has been found. Mr. Yellow asks if the circle guards' rooms were also inspected, and Square Guard responds how this was one of the first orders he gave after the incident, but nothing was found, to which Mr. Yellow slowly nods in understanding. Mrs. Blue asks if a player could have really smuggled in this poison. Square Guard answers that whilst this is possible, all 109 players were thoroughly checked on re-entrance to the games, including tests for the handling of any illicit substances. Whilst traces of Class A, B, and C drugs were detected between the 109 returning players, no forms of poison were detected on any of them. However, after a brief yet thoughtful silence, Squareguard exclaims, "Onwards and upwards, Game 3. He declares that for this game, the remaining 54 players will be divided into 6 groups of 9. He gestures to the Triangle Guards and informs he will be splitting them into 2 pairs, alternating control between each game. Mrs. Blue turns discreetly and looks across to Mr. Orange. Squareguard seems to notice this and chuckles quietly, but informs he is splitting them the old-fashioned way, with boys against girls. Mr. Yellow cautiously turns to Mr. Orange, and Mrs. Blue breathes out as Squareguard clarifies that Mr. Orange and Mr. Yellow will be working together, whilst Miss Green and Mrs. Blue will form the other pair, which is in fact how they are already sat. Squareguard takes 4 booklets from his desk and hands one to each of the Triangle Guards. At the front of these updated player booklets is a double page with the pictures of all 54 remaining players. Squareguard then declares that they have 1 hour to decide the specifics of this game. He pulls out his remote control and presses a button. The screen activates, showing a timer of 1 hour, which begins to count down. The moment he has left the room, Mrs. Blue suggests they split the 54 players in order of their numbers. Mr. Orange addresses her as darling, and begins to suggest another idea, when she interrupts that she is not his darling, but a 42-year-old married mother of 2. Mr. Yellow rapidly approaches Mrs. Blue, and assures that Mr. Orange did not mean to offend her. Mr. Orange scoffs, but Mrs. Blue tells him to not be an idiot. Mr. Yellow quickly places himself between them, and advises that they all need to stay focused on the task at hand. Mrs. Blue huffs, and suggests how in this case, they allocate the groups at random for a fairer set of games. Miss Green replies to hell with being fair, and claims that an entertaining game will be more impressive than a fair one. This debate continues between Mrs. Blue and Miss Green, and the women soon become aggravated with each other. After Mrs. Blue is called a daft old Paddy hag, she throws in a notepad in frustration, narrowly avoiding Miss Green, who bursts out laughing. Mr. Orange turns around and shakes his head in apparent amusement, but Mr. Yellow marches in and shouts to stop. When silence is finally achieved, he suggests they take turns to choose the 9 players for each of their games. Although she still seems amused by Mrs. Blue's outrage, Miss Green turns to Mr. Yellow and asks what he means. He quickly clarifies how when it is his and Mr. Orange's turn, they choose the 9 players they think will play together to provide the best game. Then for the next group, Miss Green and Mrs. Blue decide which 9 players they want, and so on. Miss Green cautiously nods and agrees to this idea, which is echoed by Mr. Orange and eventually Mrs. Blue as well. The pairs then convene at opposite ends of the table, with Mrs. Blue doing so very reluctantly. However, after Mr. Yellow gives her a nod of assurance, she starts speaking to Miss Green, albeit with a clear underlying tension. After Mr. Yellow and Mr. Orange announce the 9 players they have chosen for Group A, Mrs. Blue and Miss Green choose players for Group B. This process goes back and forth until the 6 groups of 9 are decided. After a few more details are decided regarding the game room's layout, Miss Green excitedly announces into the dormitory that players will now be transported to the next game. Within minutes, a convoy of 10 trucks are carrying players along a wet woodland road bordered by thick forests, from which an eclectic chorus of tweets and squawks can be heard. This journey lasts longer than those preceding the earlier games, but the trucks eventually reach the far side of the island and park outside a large cubic building. After being escorted from the trucks and into this building, players are led by the Circle Guards to a relatively small room with a blandly designed floor and walls. Following the Triangle Guards' instructions, Circle Guards allocate the players into 6 lines, which are labelled from A to F. Players in each line are then made to sit in order of their numbers, with the lowest at the front to the highest at the back. Some players sat with Alan in line B or next to him in lines A and C voice objections to being sat so close to him, but the threat presented by the Circle Guards' guns soon silences them. After a tense minute, the 9 players in line A are ordered to their feet and escorted through the nearest door. The third person in this line is player 54, the old religious man with rosacea, and 2 guards are practically forced to carry him to his feet. He struggles to walk independently, but manages to mumble the Lord's Prayer as he passes through the door. Similarly to in the previous game, uneasy chatter begins amongst waiting players. However, unlike the previous game, the Circle Guards soon demand silence. A few confused and indignant looks are given, but this order is followed without any real protest. Alan, player 23, is placed towards the front of line B, with only player 14, the young man with a long side parting, and player 17, the old Geordie woman with grey curls, sat ahead, although the former is carefully covering his face with his jacket. After a while, player 17 looks round cautiously to Alan, and he catches her eye. She gives a quick, pursed smile, then turns back and covers a cut on her hand with her tracksuit. Tracy, player 26, is sat behind Alan, and she eyes him calmly whenever he looks round. At times, she glances over to Yusuf, player 28, who is sat in line E, although he remains stone-faced and only looks back once. Behind Tracy is player 86, the young man with patchy freckles and a scratched face. He sits quietly, but occasionally becomes distracted by the deep breathing of Mary, player 95, who is sat stretching her arms and legs behind him. Following Mary in line B is Diane, player 96, whose hands seem to be vibrating. Player 123, the young man with tattoos and braces, is after her, and he turns around several times to mouth reassurances to player 160, the young woman with blonde dreadlocks. After a few moments of silence, Alan turns and looks down the line to Diane, who smiles back. She then turns to Steve, player 98, who is sat in line E, 3 spaces behind Yusuf, player 28. At one point, Steve looks back and notices Nicholas, player 173, who is sat directly behind him in this line. They seem to recognise each other from their prior interaction and share a quick nod before facing back to the front. As for Joanne, player 175, she is sat behind Nicholas, but spends most of this time focused on communicating without words to Jeff, player 171, who is placed across from her in line D. Almost 5 minutes after the players in line A exited the waiting room, a series of shots are faintly heard from behind the wall. Some gasps and quiet whimpers follow, until Mr. Orange announces from the speakers that player 54 has been eliminated. A few more minutes pass quietly, until a single muffled shot sounds, and Mr. Orange announces that player 150, a petite woman with a blonde perm, has been eliminated. A few sorrowful sighs briefly sound within the waiting room. After a little less than 3 minutes, a scream and series of shots are distantly heard. Mr. Yellow then announces that player 109, a young man with greying hair, has been eliminated. This time, the reaction from awaiting players is minimal. A screen on the wall activates, and the number of players remaining descends from 54 to 51, whilst the prize fund increases from £10,800,000 to £11 million. Mr. Yellow summarises how this means player 34, the old man with one eye, player 53, the middle-aged woman with a blonde quiff and chunky glasses, player 125, a middle-aged woman with a half ponytail, player 127, an older man with a West African accent, player 148, a young Asian woman with long plaited hair, and player 161, a middle-aged man with empty eyes, have all passed this game. A few sighs of relief follow throughout the waiting room, and even a scattered applause, which seems to surprise the guards present, but they call for silence again, which resumes in due course. For the next 2 minutes, a pin could be heard to drop, until Miss Green's voice sounds over the speakers, asking for the players in line B to make their way into the arena. Some players look up in bewilderment, and a few whisper, "Arena?" Mrs. Blue is then heard, rattly telling Miss Green that she asked her not to call the room that name. A few players grin as Miss Green is heard telling Mrs. Blue to lighten up and have a Guinness or something. Yet while Mrs. Blue responds, Miss Green swears aloud in the realization that the speaker is still on. The sound stops abruptly, and some players laugh, until several guards turn off the safety to their guns. Line B are subsequently ordered to their feet. Mary turns around and asks for support, but accidentally jabs Diane's stomach as she puts out her hand. Diane winces and tells Mary to watch what she's doing. Mary shoots a cynical look to Diane, who exhales impatiently and says she knows what she means. Mary asks if she is going to help her or not. Diane looks her up and down, then takes her hand and leads her with the rest of the line, through the door, along a corridor, and up to a large red door, where 2 armed guards are waiting. The players are escorted into the southern entrance of an enormous room, with a width and length of approximately 30 metres. In the very centre of the room sits a circular contraption, with a height of just 1 metre and a radius of roughly 2 metres, which gives it the appearance of an oversized wheel. Upon a closer inspection, one can see 9 red handles spread evenly around the rim of this wheel, along with a large red arrow connected to its centre. Most of the room's floor is smooth, but the ground surrounding the wheel is uneven and rocky, with a few sharp edges. Beyond this central wheel are 4 separate lines of unnatural but seemingly realistic greenery, which form a square-like shape. Along the northern side of this central square are short but thick bushes, with stubby branches and even some thorns protruding outwards. The opposing southern side is comprised of light hollow bushes, with delicate flowers and short dangling vines. The west side of the square is lined with 5 dwarf trees, placed at equal intervals, but with long leafy branches, which allow these trees almost enough length to touch each other. The opposing east side is formed by a dense and opaque yet finely trimmed hedge of just over 2 meters in height. However, the 4 sides of the centre square do not quite intersect, leaving spaces at each of these corners, which are large enough to pass through. As for the walls and ceilings of this room, they are decorated in an iridescent black and red, featuring the silhouettes of children at play. In the northwest corner of the room sits a gigantic climbing frame, which almost reaches the ceiling. It is comprised of over 100 black and red cylindrical bars, linked together in a repetitive cubic pattern, thereby creating a structure that amounts to little more than a hollow shell. Across the room in the northeast corner is a shiny slide, which reaches almost all the way to the ceiling as well. Leading up to its summit is a ladder of black and red steps. Whilst the ground on both sides of the slide is paved with dried mud, the mud at the bottom of the slide is becoming wet and boggy. At the other end of the eastern hedge, within the southeast corner, is a large treehouse. Each corner of the small building is supported by a thick pillar, painted in a swirling pattern of black and red. A ladder of the same colours leads into the treehouse's underside. The inside is empty, but its northern and western walls feature gaps, in which windows and a door could be placed respectively. Moving over to the southwest corner of the room is a large playground roundabout, with bars and alternating floor segments of black and red. Surrounded by a large mass of light sand on either side, this circular feature can be pushed to spin, although its bars are cold and sharp. Square Guard and the Triangle Guards are currently in the gallery, which overlooks the southern entrance to this room. It is from here that the Triangle Guards are able to control the ongoing games, as well as display information upon a large screen on the western wall between the climbing frame and roundabout. When the 9 players of Group B are escorted into the room, most of them begin to explore. As Diane instinctively walks towards the roundabout on their left, Mary follows and asks what is inside this room. Diane gives a brief description of how big the room is, until she notices player 86, the young man with patchy freckles and a scratched face, stood on the other side of the roundabout, warily shaking his head at her and pointing to Mary. Diane becomes distracted by his warning, and she fails to finish her sentence. Mary asks her to continue describing this room, but she huffs out impatiently and tells her to ask someone else. 4 armed circle guards suddenly enter and order the 9 players to report to the centre of the room. Player 123, the young man with tattoos and braces, addresses player 160, the young woman with blonde dreadlocks, as Vivian, and takes her hand. They approach, and player 123 purposefully pulls Vivian away from Alan. Mary puts out a hand and calls for Diane. Player 86 shoots her another glance, but she breathes out and walks over to Mary. She lazily puts out an arm, which Mary takes, and the pair arrive at the central wheel just after the other players. One of the guards then stands by the wheel and calls forward player 14, the young man with a long side parting. He gives a strange look to the guard and asks why she has chosen him, but the guard repeats her order. Player 14 slowly walks towards the wheel and is instructed to stand by the red handle, facing the northern side of this room. Although he still seems confused, he hesitantly follows this order. Player 14's right hand is then cuffed to this handle by the guard. Some players watch in bewilderment and whisper to each other, but player 14 barely reacts and ruffles his messy hair with his free hand. Player 17, the old Geordie woman, is ordered to the next clockwise handle, and after being cuffed, she jokes how she always assumed she would be in cuffs after a few sherries at least. She snorts with laughter, and some players, most notably player 14, seem minorly amused. The guard then cuffs Alan to the adjacent handle. Player 17 seems uncomfortable to be placed next to him, but player 14 appears more perturbed and covers his mouth with his free hand. Tracy is cuffed to the adjacent handle, followed by player 86, Mary, Diane, player 123, then Vivian, player 160, who completes the circle next to player 14. Whilst the guards walk away and begin to discuss arrangements amongst themselves, Mary quietly pleads to Diane to describe what is behind her. Diane begins to whisper that there are some bushes and trees, when player 14 clicks his fingers and orders her not to help Helen Keller. Player 86 nods, but Vivian shoots player 14 a scolding look. Other players seem torn, although they remain quiet. Meanwhile, in the gallery, Mrs. Blue and Miss Green are sat behind a control table, directly before the overlooking window. Mr. Yellow and Mr. Orange are also spectating from egg-shaped chairs to the side, while Square Guard stands behind the women, with a clipboard and pen at the ready. Mrs. Blue turns to Miss Green and asks if she is now ready. Miss Green is looking over the controls and responds that she still needs to figure out some of these buttons. However, Mrs. Blue activates the speaker and reads from her notes. She proceeds to welcome players and allows a suspenseful pause before announcing that they are about to play Game 3, It. All players listen, and Mrs. Blue informs how shortly one of them will be chosen at random to start the first round as the tagged player, also known as It. She explains that if this player manages to tag another player and say It whilst doing so, this tagged player will become It, until he tags another player, and so on. Mrs. Blue then declares that whichever player is It when the time runs out will be eliminated. She adds how there will be 3 rounds in this game, each lasting 1 minute and 30 seconds, which will result in 3 players being eliminated, whilst the remaining 6 will pass to the next game. While player 14 looks around to the other players with a focused expression, player 86 asks if this game isn't called Tig. However, the only response he receives is player 17 gasping, "Oh heck." Mrs. Blue continues that the use of excessive violence is banned, to which player 123 laughs nervously. She then explains how the arrow will now be spun, and the player it lands upon will begin the game as the tagged player. Without being touched, the arrow on top of the wheel begins to spin. Player 17 and Diane both gasp, while all other players fall silent and watch. Vivian's breathing hastens, and she desperately tries to pull her cuffed wrist away from the handle, but player 123 soon puts his hand on hers and whispers to save her strength. In the gallery, Miss Green checks that the microphone is off, and in a dumbfounded manner, asks Mrs. Blue why she ordered for no excessive violence. As if she was expecting this question, Mrs. Blue swiftly replies how she grew tired of the petty fistfights in Miss Green's Lego games. Miss Green stares for a while at Mrs. Blue, who turns back and adjusts the arrow-spinning dial. Square Guard nods and writes more notes behind them. Players watch avidly as the arrow decelerates, and a mixture of winces, breaths, and gasps are heard from certain players whenever it swings towards them. Suspenseful gasps follow, and the arrow slows past 86, then creeps past Mary, until it comes to a stop in front of Diane. The silence is pierced by the word fuck, and all handcuffs except for the one attached to Diane spring open. The timer starts counting down from 1 minute 30, and most players dart off in scattered directions across the rocky ground which surrounds the central wheel. The screen on the wall suddenly displays the words tagged player, with the number 96 below. Although Diane's hand is still firmly cuffed to the wheel, she pulls with all her might and screams that this is not fair. As Tracy sprints to the climbing frame, she brushes past and knocks over player 17, but carries on running without looking back. Alan runs straight for the treehouse, yet he trips onto a sharp edge of the ground, which causes him to fall and cut the skin across his left hand, whilst player 123 and Vivian sprint past. Mary slowly backs away from the central wheel, towards the southern bushes. She looks around, seeming to listen for other players' movements over Diane's shrill complaints. Watching from the gallery, Mrs. Blue jokes how they may as well change the tagged player on the screen to 95 right now, but Miss Green cautiously responds how 96 may surprise them. She then asks if Mrs. Blue now agrees that this was the correct choice of player to kick things off. Back at the central wheel, Diane screams to be let go and keeps yanking on her handcuff until 1 minute 25 is left on the timer and it suddenly opens. She is still pulling with such force that she falls back to the floor. After wincing in pain, she gazes over and sees Alan running to the treehouse after player 123 and Vivian. They climb up into the treehouse, yet just as Alan climbs onto the ladder after them, player 123 shouts down through the floor of the treehouse to find somewhere else. Alan looks up in discontent and begins to reason how there is plenty of room, but player 123 looks back down to him and cracks his knuckles. Alan instinctively leans back and almost falls from the ladder, although he manages to grab onto the nearest pillar, which stops him from falling to the floor. He scrambles down the ladder and hides behind this pillar, peeping out to see Tracy ascending the first levels of the climbing frame on the opposite side of the room. In the central square, Diane is looking all around the room, but with 1 minute 21 remaining, She turns south to Mary, who is still stood by the light bushes. With a sound of trepidation, Mary calls Diane's name and asks if she is it. Mary receives no answer and gradually tenses her fists. Diane looks up to the timer, then she creeps towards Mary, who gulps with fear and lets out quick breaths as she slowly backs away. She appears distracted and disorientated by the sound of other players' movements and hushed voices around the room, which drowns out the sound of Diane's footsteps stopping just 2 meters before her. Despite Mary's pleas for help, Diane focuses and carefully extends a hand towards her. Mary tenses her body and asks if this is Diane, although once again she receives no answer. She takes another step back and collides with the light bushes. She jumps in angst and fearfully grabs onto these bushes, then turns back to Diane and cautiously begs for help. Diane's hand is now less than 2 feet from Mary, but after seeing the panic in Mary's eyes, she grits her teeth in annoyance and pulls back her hand. Now apparently aware of Diane's proximity, Mary tries to convince her to let them work together. However, Diane interrupts, ordering Mary to head right and right again to the treehouse, where she should be safe. With 1 minute 14 remaining, Alan watches from behind the pillar as Mary immediately runs along the southern row of bushes, then through the gap, towards his position beneath the treehouse. Diane darts her eyes around in anguish for a few seconds, until she spots player 14 hiding behind a small dwarf tree on the lower west side. She gasps and immediately chases after him, towards the roundabout in the southwest corner. Meanwhile, Mary runs into the space beneath the treehouse and almost collides with the ladder, where she hears Alan whisper at her to stop. Mary does stop, but jolts around to Alan and pulls his neck straight into her chest with her forearm. He seems dazed by this sudden move, and Mary asks who he is. He struggles to stand at this angle, yet manages to glance to the west. Alan sees Diane coming to a stop in the sand by the roundabout, whilst player 14 grins from its other side in the southwest corner. Alan chokingly replies to Mary that he is friends with Diane, and croaks how they can be seen right now from the open, and should hide behind the pillar. Mary hesitates, although upon hearing player 14's goading across the roundabout to Diane, she releases her grip on Alan, and he gently leads her by the arm behind the nearest pillar. Once they are hidden from sight, Alan notices blood dripping from the cut he has just received on his left hand, and he hurries to cover it with his tracksuit jacket. With 1 minute 3 remaining, Diane tries running one way round the roundabout, but player 14 quickly mirrors her movement and remains on the other side. Diane tries this a few more times, before kicking the sand and shouting that he is a prick. Player 14 laughs, then looks straight to the north for a few seconds and smiles. Diane is about to try chasing him once more, but when the timer hits 55 seconds, she stops and glares round. Her eyes lighten a little as she sees player 17, the old Geordie woman, looking out from behind the furthest of the trees on the western side. Player 17 quickly hides herself again behind this tree, but Diane charges in her direction. She gasps and turns to run east, past the northern row of thick bushes. As Diane cuts through the central square, player 17 trips and falls to the ground, halfway along this row of bushes. She curses in a panic and begins to get up, when Diane reaches her and practically pounces onto her back. Diane shouts "it," and the screen switches to identify player 17 as the tagged player. Diane sprints back with a grin to the west, and does a rapid 360-degree turn, then focuses on the climbing frame. Tracy watches from the upper levels as player 17 tries to run after Diane. However, by the time she has reached the ground beneath the climbing frame, Diane is already several meters above her, ascending towards Tracy's position. Player 17 grumbles and looks south to see player 14 still stood behind the roundabout. She calls for help, addressing him as Richard, and shouting that she cannot find anyone else. Still hidden behind a pillar of the treehouse, Alan watches discreetly as player 17 runs towards Richard, player 14. Mary then whispers to Alan, asking where Diane is. He looks up to the climbing frame, in which he has almost climbed to Tracy's level, and answers, "Safe for now." Mary nods with a cautious smile. Richard warily runs along the southern side of the room, towards the treehouse, and player 17 continues to chase him, begging for his help at least, although he turns back and shouts to keep looking. With 45 seconds left, Alan peeps out from behind the pillar of the treehouse and spots Richard pacing backwards in their direction. Whilst Richard encouraged player 17, Alan carefully pulls Mary to lean with him against the wall behind the pillar. As she grips onto Alan, Richard unknowingly passes them and reaches the ladder leading up into the treehouse. Player 17 stops for breath near the southern wall and watches Richard begin to climb the ladder. However, when he is halfway up to the treehouse, He notices Alan and Mary crouched by the pillar. Richard smirks and looks ahead to see player 17 stumbling towards the treehouse in exhaustion. He addresses her as Clara and points to Mary and Alan, exclaiming that he has just found Helen Keller and Boy George. With 37 seconds left, Alan swears and instinctively runs north. Mary frantically feels against the wall and calls out for him, which makes Richard laugh. Alan swears again, then runs back and grabs Mary by her forearm, just as Clara, player 17, jogs to within meters of the treehouse. With Richard just behind them, Alan runs with Mary into the central square. Alan spots the rocky ground before the central wheel and avoids it by pulling Mary with him to the left, towards the row of dwarf trees on the western side. Alan stops with Mary just before these trees. He then hears Richard asking Clara in an aggravated tone why she didn't go after those two. Alan frowns and jolts round to see Clara running after Richard towards the slide in the northeast corner of the room, and gasping in response how she can't keep up. Richard shakes his head and climbs the slide's ladder. Clara hopelessly ambles back towards the central square until she hears a scraping sound at the top of the slide. At this moment, Clara slowly turns round and sees player 86 appear at the top of the slide. A look of joyful relief appears in her eyes, and she shouts that there's a young lad up there. With 20 seconds left, Richard hastily continues up the ladder. Player 86 looks back over the top of the slide to see this, then carefully pulls himself onto the highest part of the slide and grips the sides. Upon seeing Richard's head appear over the top of the slide, player 86 grits his teeth and holds onto the highest part of the slide, while Clara is poised upon the dried mud next to the bottom of the slide. She shouts at Richard to help. Player 86 shouts for mercy, but a second later, Richard punches down onto his hands, and his grip gives way. Player 86 gasps in pain as he falls down the upper half of the slide. However, he manages to grab hold of the sides halfway down the slide, albeit with a painful wince. Player 86 angrily calls Richard a jerk. With 14 seconds left, Clara is trying to reach up a hand to player 86 from next to the slide. This causes him to panic and pull his legs up to his chest as he continues to grip on. Clara carefully treads through the boggy mud to the bottom of the slide and gives a sympathetic smile to player 86. Richard sits himself down on top of the slide. Clara tells player 86, "Sorry, pet." He gasps in bewilderment, then looks up with even more anxiety to see Richard sliding down towards him. Richard collides with player 86, who is hit with a solid clunk. As player 86 slips down the rest of the slide, Richard grips onto the sides and stops moving. With 7 seconds remaining, player 86 crashes into the boggy mud at the bottom of the side, which results in a deafening squelch and splatter of mud in many directions. Due to the mud that has just entered his eyes, player 86 yelps that he cannot see, and frantically tries to clear this mud from his eyes, although this only worsens his situation. When 4 seconds remain, Clara grips onto the slide, then leans over and taps him on the back of the head with the word "it." She staggers back over the dried mud, and player 86 shouts as he tries to get up to run after her, but she is already several meters away. Player 86 falls again into the mud and swears at Richard, who continues to watch from halfway up the slide. A few seconds later, a klaxon sounds, and player 86 blinks open his muddied eyes to see himself identified as the tagged player on the screen. He initially struggles to speak, but soon begins to stammer for mercy. Miss Green then announces through the speakers that player 86 is eliminated. He begs for his life, until a circle guard bursts through the southern doors and walks straight towards the slide. Player 86 begins to cry and he screams that his girlfriend is pregnant, although he is sprayed with bullets before he can finish his sentence. He collapses back, banging his head with a metallic clang against the slide.